Hey, Nique, welcome to the next episode of The Invisible Men.
My pleasure, Ian. My absolute pleasure. We got a great guest today.
Yeah, we have the inimitable Dumisani Washington, who is truly a Renaissance man, a musician, leader, founded in a group called the Black Solidarity with Israel organization. Can't wait to talk about that, your religious journey. So many things, Dumisani, that I think our listeners will really be compelled to hear your story. So welcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Glad to be here. I saw my first one of your podcast maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I've been a fan. So appreciate you having me on.
All right, fantastic. Well, then why don't we start with a little bit of your backstory? You know, before you became Dumisani Washington, the leader you are today. When you were younger, when did you realize that race was a thing, that this was like had some meaning to people?
As long back as I can remember, right? So I grew up in California from the late 60s on, but I was actually born in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so both my parents are from there. They had their roots there. My father's father was a sharecropper in the rural area. My mother grew up in North Little Rock. She knew the family who actually desegregated Central High School there.
Oh, right.
She was a proud member of what was at that time, the Scipio A. Jones High School. Scipio A. Jones High School was the only high school in segregated South in Arkansas where Black students were able to go. So wherever you lived in the state, you'd have to come to that place. And if there was another one, she was not aware of it. And she was very proud of it. So I grew up hearing these stories, everything from my father on the farm with his father, the sharecropping incidents and stuff. I write about it in my book, Zionism in the Black Church, where I actually talk about how I was born. I was not born Dumisani. I was born Dennis Ray Washington. And Dumisani was an African naming ceremony that started, it was back in the 1990s, which I'm sure we'll probably get into that a little bit. And so, yeah, and between those stories, right, those stories, I always knew I was a Black young man, but there was no pejoratives with that, right? I learned my father, I learned about some of the struggles there. I tell a couple of the stories in my book. And then my mother in particular, she was so proud of her Black community. She didn't call it Black community because it was what it was. You know, for those who were during the segregated era, segregation was what it was. So everybody was Black. The doctors were Black. The lawyers were Black. The store owners were Black. The preachers were Black. I mean, the schools, all of those things. Right? It's like watching the Cosby Show. Now, for those listening, I'm not saying it was rosy. Obviously, there was difficulties, there were struggles, everything, but there was
what you're saying is that even in the higher echelons of society, you had Black representation at every single level.
Yes, and so they didn't call it Black excellence. It was just excellence, right? There's no adjective to it, right? So my mom, the reason I mentioned the school is because those were the things that shaped me, gentlemen. It was she would tell me the stories about their marching band, the drill team, the basketball team, the football team. And the reason why, as I got older, I realized she told me about the story. I learned about integration versus segregation from those conversations. My mom was also a seamstress, so she would talk while she was sewing. She would talk in the kitchen. Now, I'm the youngest of 7 children, so it wasn't just me, right? We would hear these stories, but it's just that I was the last one home after a while, and we would have some one-on-one conversations. And she loved that school, and she told me, and I'll end it with a long introduction, I learned to be suspicious of government-mandated fixes as a child, not knowing this, right?
Wow.
She explained to me how she said Dumisani, although my name wasn't Dumisani at the time, she said, the original fight was not integration. She said we were fighting about resources. She says, what would happen is that the schools would receive revenues based on the taxes, right? The taxes in terms of the residential and commercial taxes, property taxes, right? He said, in the segregated South, often the white controlled government would take the lion's share of those taxes and invest it in the white schools. Hence, they would have the better the science equipment,
facilities, right?
Their books were always 10 years ahead. In other words, they had the older books. The Black students would have the older textbooks from the 1940s, 50s, and the white students would have the other ones. So the protest, she said, was around the fairness, the fair distribution of those resources. They did not equate white schools with better. That's what she said. Her thing was that we don't want to go to that school. We just want you to stop robbing our school, right? Again, and for her, their schools, their students, very, very high academic. I mean, they graduated and became doctors, lawyers, Congress people, all those things. Her younger or older brother, Levi C. Adams, my uncle who passed away about a year ago, graduated, went on to get his doctorate. He became a doctor and was on staff at Brown University for years. You can Google his name. There's a couple of awards named after him. So that's my uncle who graduated from Scipio Jones High School. They were proud of that school, but when integration happened, the school sat there like a mausoleum. I'm sorry for this long introduction. She said, Dumisani, here was our fear. Our fear was what was realized. They would then integrate forcibly, shut down our school, fire all of the Black administrators, educators, and all those, and keep the least performing ones to mock us. That's what I learned as a kid. Wow. So that was the DEI, to use that term, from then. She said they kept the worst ones, gave them positions so they could point to them and say, see, these Black people are incapable, not knowing that that Black person who was employed in that Black district was in a lower position because they weren't performing to the level of the standard, right? So I learned this from my mom. So by the time I'm hearing all these stories about what the civil rights movement was, I'm sitting there as a kid in school going, yeah, I know a little bit more of the story than what you guys are actually telling right now.
That's an amazing. Well, go ahead, Nique. I know you want to jump in.
I just wanted to put an exclamation point on what you just described. An example that never leaves my mind is Negro League Baseball. It's the same exact scenario.
Absolutely.
You'll find some literature that pities the Black player because they played in Negro League ball.
Yes,
well,
sir.
In fact, several years, Negro League Baseball was more profitable than white baseball.
Yes.
They introduced the concept of the All-Star game.
Yes, sir.
We don't need to talk about the talent that was there. But what happened when integration came?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
They didn't integrate the teams into white baseball. They said, we'll give you $1,500 for Willie Mays. We'll give you $1,500 for Henry Aaron. And what happened in a short time? Half those teams are owned by Black men.
Yes.
That was gone.
Yes.
A quarter of those teams owned the rail companies that transported the players around. And then what did we get for it?
Right.
Now we have to beg to be owners of teams. For the first 15 years, we had to sit all the way in the back. We couldn't even have good seats. But your example is even more real world. But people don't understand that there's a two-sided sword to this integration argument.
Well, like I wouldn't say more real world. Yours is just, my dad loved baseball, right? So what you're saying right there, I learned that from him, right? Satchel Paige, his favorite pitcher, I believe by the time he went to the majors, he was like 41, 42 years old, still throwing 90 mile an hour heat, right? Still striking out players, right? And then we're saying is that, yes, it wasn't done. The integration of baseball wasn't done for us as if it was, some sort of love thing. It was money, right? So the white owners saw, I could make more money if the Black patrons would actually come and buy tickets as well. And I'm not denigrating them. Like, money is money, right? They're like going, okay, so what are we going to do? We need to get those. Plus, these Black ball players are amazing. And what's amazing about those names too, what they call them, the Ethiopian clowns. They gave them sometimes such derogatory names. But again, many of those owners, as you said, were Black, vendors, Black, right? These things were all Black-owned businesses that were completely wiped out once, the Jackie Robinson, who was not the first. The first was another gentleman from the Cleveland Indians. I tell that story all the time. He wasn't as he couldn't keep it as calm as Jackie Robinson. He's one of those, you say something to him and we're about to go in the parking lot, right?
Right.
Yes, and it's okay. Well, maybe he's not the guy. Maybe we need to go with somebody else. But yes, these players distinguished themselves, right? They went on to lead these teams and all these different areas and everything. So yeah, absolutely. So 100%, this was the same thing. And I talk about that both in my book and sometimes in my lectures. And what I do in that is, as my mother was saying, they would argue. So they would have these debates in the basement of the church. She said, Dumisani, this is where we would discuss these things. We would discuss what was going on, what we felt was best. They said by the time the civil rights movement became a move for integration, she said, some of us felt the movement got hijacked. That's not what we were saying. We were saying, treat us fairly. We're not saying we think your schools are better, therefore let us into your school. So that was an
This,
interesting thing for my kids.
this, we could spend an entire episode just on this, because the opposite of segregation is not forced integration.
Yes, sir. Yes,
right?
sir.
It's desegregation.
Absolutely.
And I think you and I have talked about the Brown versus Board of Education decision and the Rosenwald schools.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right? The Rosenwald schools are probably the greatest example
Absolutely.
of Black self-determination in public education. Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald came together and created 5,000 schools throughout the South to educate exclusively Black kids.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
And when Brown versus Board of Education came, there was this assumption that separate meant unequal and inherently inferior.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right?
Absolutely. No, 100%. We talk a lot about the Rosenwald Washington synergy, if you will. Both in our organization, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, because we're talking about a Black-Jewish connection. And oftentimes when people say that, they think, very lovingly towards the civil rights movement, right? And of course, the Jewish population was disproportionately represented within the civil rights movement, right? Some of the first founders of the NAACP were actually Jewish, right? You had a lot of that, the attorneys and all of those things that happened. And there were some controversies that were there, right? But there was this within that thing, this legit, let's see if we can come together and work together. Well, before all of the civil rights part of it was Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, right? Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck fame, a legit billionaire, even by the standards of the early 1900s. And more than half of his philanthropic work was actually in the Black community, right? So he, not just the schools and the Rosenwald Fellows in terms of the scholarships, but that huge apartment complex that he built that was like a state-of-the-art thing, right? It was not the projects as we knew as they became later on in the 70s and the 80s, but it was a state-of-the-art. I mean, people, I wish I could remember some of the names. We did a whole study on it, but if I'm not mistaken, some of the greatest jazz musicians and other educators, Miseducation of the Negro was written by
Carter G. Woodson.
Thank you. He was one of the residents of the buildings that Julius Rosenwald built, right? So this goes way, way back. This was that Black-Jewish synergy, which again, Rosenwald said himself that as a marginalized person who was sending money to Russia because of what was going on with the Jews there, he would drive to work from his suburbs of Chicago to where his office was and pass by all of these Black people who had come from the South, living in very squalid conditions, trying to get a better life for themselves. And he said, why am I spending all of my money helping my Jewish brothers and sisters? Yeah, legit. But I have humanity right here that needs my help. And his rabbi was one of the founding members of the NAACP. So there was this real, as you were saying, a grassroots kind of, it wasn't mandated by the government because the government didn't care about Black kids who didn't go to school, right? This was a situation where they came together. And lastly, it was Rosenwald's, he was inspired by Washington. He read Up From Slavery. He went to some of his lectures. He reached out to him. That's how that actually started. And once they began to talk, Rosenwald became, I believe, if not mistaken, the first Jewish board of trustee member of Tuskegee, right? Their relationship went really, really, really deep. It only lasted because Washington, of course, died in 1915. So the whole Rosenwald-Washington era was from 1912 to around 1915. But of course, Rosenwald continues for decades.
Right, the schools.
Yes, the schools that you said, Ian, over 5,000. Some of them, most of them that exist now are historical landmarks. But to me, as you said, it was a powerful reminder of what we did as a people, and then extrapolating from there, what Black and Jewish community people came together to do. Wasn't politicians, it wasn't none of those things, right? It was just people coming together to say, hey, let's see how we can come together and solve this problem.
Wow. I mean, you and I talked about it. Someday there should be a movie made about the Rosenwald schools.
Yes.
About this incredible triumph.
Yes.
I mean, Maya Angelou.
Yes.
You know,
Charles Drew was a Rosenwald fellow.
John Lewis.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Baldwin, the writer, and my brain is not working. James Baldwin. These are all different people. Like, and then my other poet friend, Langston Hughes. These are all these famous Black Americans whose secondary study was done because of the philanthropic work of this Jewish man who nobody really knew. It's in one of the short documentaries I did see about the Rosenwald. It said that one of the kids would say they see Rosenwald's picture and they see Booker T. Washington's picture, and she said, "Teacher, excuse me, who's that white man?" So they would chuckle, and then they would explain who that person was that was on the wall, because they didn't know who he was, right? That was so. Again, I am actually talking to a Black American gentleman who does film, and we're not talking about that one. We're talking about a different one. But in our next meeting, Ian, that'll be our next conversation. While we're planning this film, let's talk about a real film that actually deals with this.
We may need to work on this. We may need to work, because it's a story that needs to be told. Because, again, ironically, Brown versus Board of Education, hailed as one of the most important Supreme Court decisions of the last century.
Yes, sir.
And ironically, its decision found that all of the Rosenwald schools were unconstitutional, because separate was unequal, and again, inherently inferior.
Yes,
so all the schools had to be closed.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, when we moved to California, my parents, again, she came from this thriving Black middle class. They weren't wealthy, well-to-do, but they were, self-sufficient Black community. We moved to California, and that's when they saw segregation on a completely different level on the West Coast. Because we eventually, from San Francisco, it wasn't as bad, as a lot of diversity there. We moved to Stockton, California, because my dad's job moved from the Bay Area out to the Valley. And it was there that my parents, my mom, she was trying to find the school. At that point, my older brothers were in high school. And she saw a segregation that was not Jim Crow, but it was Jim Crow light. And it wasn't mandated, but it was just understood that Black folks lived over here and white folks lived over here, but almost in a very almost kind of negative, antagonistic sort of way, right? You don't cross these tracks. The only reason I tell that, and I'll end it right here, when she looked for schools for the kids, for my brothers, she found that same color line on the West Coast also affected the quality of the schools. So they chose to live in the predominantly white part of the town, not because they didn't want to be around other Black people, but because they saw the schools, and they were horrified when they saw the contrast. She was looking for Scipio A. Jones High School, right? She was looking for that in Stockton. When she found that it didn't exist, and that what she had to do to give them a better education. So yes, to your point, Ian, that becomes the implied separate is not equal. But of course, that's a manufactured, right? That had nothing to do with Black people not being capable, had everything to do with how that actual racism was actually being played out in a way where resources were not there, where access was not there. This was a very much of an intentional type of thing. So my parents, they didn't really realize that until they got to California.
Wow.
Yes,
wow.
Sir. Which again, I know we could talk about that all day long.
No. This is great. So, but before we leap into some of the work you've now done, actually, in particularly with the Jewish community and in Israel, tell us. So Dennis Ray became Dumisani. So tell us a little bit about, and what age was that when that shifted?
I was in my early 20s, maybe. I'm 58 now, so it's 30 something years ago. I was 93, 90, somewhere around in there. I can't remember. I have to look it up and see again. So what happened was, and again, all these long stories, I'll make them short just because of the time. It was a very much of a spiritual and cultural journey for me. These things were blended and melded. I became a Christian at a very, very young age, maybe 6, 7 or so, and was very inquisitive.
Was that a conscious choice? Was that
yes.
a conscious choice?
Yeah. So I grew up in church, right? My dad was a deacon in the choir. I remember my mom was on the matron board. And for all the people who are listening, who I call the church babies, you're there 5-6 days a week, right? First one there, last one gone, and all that stuff. So I'm at everything from choir rehearsals. And then plus I was a young musician. So I started playing for the choirs and everything when I was in grade school. So not only I was always there, but now I'm part of the what's happening in terms of services and in Sunday school and everything. And that was my life. And so my mom even tells the story, I tell her in the book, that as a baby, she would sit in the front back in the day. These churches, they look almost like synagogues. You have the women on one side, men on the other side. The ladies be wearing all white and the guys be on those specific Sundays. And as a baby, I would bounce on her knee as long as the choir was singing. I was fine as long as the music was going. As soon as the music stopped and the pastor got to preach, she said I would look right in his face and cry at the top of my voice. I was a baby. I didn't know what was going on. She said I gave him a complex. And he was really like, he would get up every Sunday like, oh, that little Washington kid is going to write. So that's how, so little did they know I was a musician. I was listening to what was inside of me, right? So say all that to say, at some point, the journey also becomes wanting to know more about my African heritage. And I say this often, gentlemen, none of it, again, was connected to anything militant. Not I'm shaking the shackles off the da-da-da-da-da. It's something was happening to me that had to do everything with researching the persecuted church and how Christians are treated in places like Sudan. There was a lot of these things kind of coming together at the same time. Researching the Jewish roots of my Christian faith, so wanting to know more about Jerusalem and Israel. And because from a little kid, I read the Old Testament more than the New Testament. I didn't know the difference, right? But I would do these things, they fused. And at some point, there was almost like a identity crisis. Whenever I would introduce myself with my given name, I began to feel like I was talking about somebody else. It was such a strange thing. I had one cousin who had actually done a naming ceremony. She changed her name from her given name to another African name. So I was the only person I could access at that time to actually begin to talk about some of those things. Later on, I had a very, very dear South African friend who's of the Zulu tribe. And that's where Dumisani comes from. Dumisani is a Zulu word from the phrase Dumisani Uyehovah, which means praise the Lord. And so after a while of that, I told my wife at that time, now I'm a young adult, I'm married, everything. I said, I think I want to change my name. My wife was fine with it. You know, the people who should be freaking out, they're fine. I talked to my parents who are no longer alive now. I had to let them know this is not a disrespect of you, love you. I'm not rejecting who I am, but this is, I'm feeling like I need to do this for this next journey, part of my journey, my life. They were like, fine. We did a family thing, did the name. So, and I can tell you this, that they had such a love for me, and I so appreciate them to this day, that they began to call. I even told them, I said, you, when I was born, you called me Dennis. So I'm not expecting you that if that's what you continue to call me, I respect my elder. That's how we're raised. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Yes, sir. No, sir. So this was always already an ongoing thing. And they both said to me, no, if that's what you're going to be called now, we're going to call you Dumisani. And gentlemen, they never once called me by my given name after that.
Wow.
My own mother and father, they would always say Dumisani. They wouldn't even slip. It was just amazing to me. So that was part of the story. It's a short version of how that actually happened.
So, okay. So now let's fast forward a little bit.
Yes, sir.
So clearly from the very early days, your identity or this concurrence of both Jewish and Christian faith were connected. Now, how has that manifested itself in your adult life? Because I think you told me you've actually been to Israel, what, 20, 30 times?
Yes, sir. About 20 times by now, between 2012 and now. And so along with that story, 2012 was my first trip to Israel. I was part of the African-American pastors delegation of Christians United for Israel. For those who know, it's a Christian Zionist organization founded by Dr. John Hagee of San Antonio, California. I went on to be on staff with that organization later on, but I wasn't on staff at the time. A luck of the draw, right? I was nobody important or anything, but I knew some people who knew some people, and then, hey, they put my name in a hat. Next thing you know, I'm in Israel. Yes, sir.
And just for our listeners, can you define what does it mean to be a Christian Zionist?
A Christian Zionist, very simply, is a Christian who believes two basic things: that Israel is the land of the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people, according to the Word of God, are His chosen, not just in that land, but in terms of their role in the earth, right? So that how what we call the Abrahamic covenant, based in Genesis chapter 12. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and through you the nations of the earth will be blessed. So Zionism is a loaded word by now, especially over the last 50, 60 years, that it has become both political and, unfortunately for some, military and all of those things. But at its essence, in terms of just scripturally, Zion, which is a biblical term, is a reference to the homeland of the Jewish people. So a Christian is somebody who believes those things, affirms those things, and believes things like if you pray for the peace of Jerusalem, like it says in Psalm 122, then God will bless you in doing that. So I hope that's a good.
Thank you for that.
Yes, sir. So that was me, right? So it's funny, I talk about in the book too, that spiritual Zionism is interwoven within the whole Black Christian experience. That goes back to not the political Zionism like the state of Israel, but the actual. So it's seen most clearly in things like the Negro spirituals: Go Down Moses, Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Elijah Rock. Most of those Negro spirituals were set in the Old Testament, many of them in the New Testament, but most of them in the Old Testament. And there was that identification of the children of Israel were a parallel for Black folks who had been enslaved and gone through Jim Crow and everything, and believed that God would lead them through. Harriet Tubman was called Black Moses. All these connections were there that goes back centuries, right? So this was the Zionism that was part of the Black Christian ethos, if you will. I mean, to this day, Lauryn Hill, her miseducation of Lauryn Hill is Jerusalem and Zion all in the album. Her first son's named Zion, marching to Zion, right? So that becomes this thing, even in contemporary life. Most Black churches, Abyssinian Baptist Church, Mount Zion Baptist Church, Zion AME, those names are often associated with Black churches because of what we would call a spiritual Zionism, if you will. So mine was the same way. My church back in Arkansas was King Solomon Baptist Church, right? Once again, one of those King Solomon reigned in Jerusalem. So this was nothing that was new or different where I was concerned. It's just that for me as a young kid, these things fascinated me in the sense of when I would read the Old Testament, I became fascinated by like the patriarchs, right? I loved the stories of Abraham and then his son Isaac and his son Jacob and then the 12 sons or David and Samuel and Saul. And as a little kid, I would read these all the time and they would capture my imagination like a kid would read a comic book. I didn't know what was going on at the time, but in my Christian faith, what continued to inform how I read the Bible was rooted in what we call the Old Testament, what the Jewish people call the Tanakh or their Bible, right? So even when I would read about Jesus, I would connect it to what I read before in Exodus or in Leviticus or whatever. That would be something I would do, not really knowing that was something that one could choose to do or not do. I didn't know the difference between the two. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. And how have you found the connection between the Black community and the Jewish community? Have contemporary politics complicated things?
Yes, they have, in the sense that, and I didn't finish that last part. It went through 2012, and that was, I was telling that story for those, if you're following this story that way. I'll end it by saying it was at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 2012 that this fusion of my life's past kind of connected. The Africa part, the Israel part, the music part. And that's when I came away with a strong sense of starting the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. So to your question there, Ian, like I was saying before, the whole spiritual Zionism, most people, whether they were Black folks who were very religious or just had other religious people in their family, you would see, it's funny, even what they call the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's one of the most Zionist songs that's ever been written, but most people don't see that, especially in the last stanza, lest our feet stray from the places our God where we met thee, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world we forget thee. That phrase is rooted in Jeremiah 51 when he says, flee Babylon and go to Jerusalem, right? But you'd have to, when James Weldon Johnson was writing it, he knew that, right? But of course it's become political. It's a perfect example. The NFL does it, the NBA does it. Are they doing it to honor James Weldon Johnson? Probably not. They're doing it for other purposes, right? But That's what the song was actually about. The tension, if you will, when it comes especially to the Israel conversation, really started in the 60s, gentlemen. And it started in the 60s because now you have a state of Israel, not just this metaphorical thing, right? The state of Israel, which begins in 1948, it declares independence. And then you have it immediately the Arab-Israeli conflict. And virtually everything that we see playing out on the news has its genesis in that particular conflict. In one way or another, Black folk were accessed during that conflict, particularly in the 60s, with a specific narrative. And that narrative was, I'm really oversimplifying this, if you are a self-respecting Black man or woman, you are by necessity pro-Palestinian, end of sentence. So that if there's any type of affiliation with, a connection to, whatever, where the state of Israel are concerned, are those Jewish people, then you were the sellout. This was a directed thing, didn't come from our community, mind you. It came from different sources that were both communist and Arab Islamist, right? I'm not saying all Arab people, I'm saying this mindset that formed a propaganda tool that used certain things, and one of its first objectives was to get Black leaders to sign off on what I just said to you.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow. And the Institute for Black Solidarity was created to
Yes,
combat this idea.
To combat that, to inform, to empower. It was inspired in large part by a 1975 organization by Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, all these civil rights lions, called the BASIC. It was an acronym, BASIC, Black Americans to Support Israel Committee, formed in 1975. Obviously, Dr. King had already been assassinated, but his friend, Dr. Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Sr., these were all members. These were all charter members of the organization, and they included everyone from sports to science. It was funny. Roy Campanella was a member. My goodness, Rosa Parks was a member. And you could name any famous Black person you could think of. They were all part of the Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. And it was formed for two basic reasons. Number one, Israel was being demonized in the United Nations as a settler, colonial, apartheid state, all of those things that we hear today. And because Zionism was deemed as racism in 1975 by the United Nations, those Black leaders stood up and also said, wait a minute, not only is that not true, we know what racism is. There's a whole movement that we were a part of to fight against it. How dare you take that language, right? And then you use it fraudulently in this way. So these Black Americans stood up and started that organization to do that.
Dumisani, my understanding is that MLK was, in fact, had planned a trip to Israel and that it was canceled because of the 6-day war. Is that true?
That is true. It's basically it's true. So he and Coretta had actually visited in the late 1950s around the time of Ghanaian independence. Now, this is before Israel had actually, the 6-day war had actually happened, and they had access to Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, but he was going to go. I mean, he did go then in the 50s. He was planning, to your point, Nique, say it again, Nique.
Yep,
right. I'm going to make sure I'm saying it correctly. He was planning a Holy Land tour. So this time he was going to go again. He was taking hundreds, possibly thousands of Black Americans. So the Holy Land tours that we see today, they didn't exist. Dr. King was going to kick it off. There was no mass pilgrimage of Christians of any ethnicity going to Israel in this way. Dr. King, he was doing it both as a Holy Land tour and also as a fundraising effort for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? The SCLC, right? So we know this because of the letters that were written back and forth between him and the prime minister at the time, both the former prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, and the current prime minister at the time. So we have copies of the letters. I share those copies in my book. They're on our website as well. So yes, it was building up. It was going to happen in November of 1967. The 6-day war was June of 1967, in which Israel had to once again, I told you that whole Arab-Israeli conflict started in the 40s. This was another flashpoint in it. Israel's fighting against Egypt and Jordan and Syria and some of the same people. They miraculously win because they're outnumbered, outgunned, the whole thing. But there's controversy, and Israel's enemies are ramping up propaganda in the media, saying that Israel's trying to steal land and so on and so forth. It was very, very embittered. Dr. King postponed it both because of the war and all of the fog of war, and he had rescheduled it for the following spring. Of course, the following spring, he was assassinated, right? He was killed on April the 4th, 1968. So he was planning to go that year because he had pushed it back. Many of in terms of the controversy, some who considered themselves anti-Israel people or whatever, they said that he changed it because he disapproved of Israel in the war. And again, we have, as the young people would say, all the receipts. None of that was true. He was concerned about some of the things that he was hearing, but unlike today where we have all this instant, something at your fingertips, he's having to get different reports about what's going on and had rescheduled his trip to go.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, Ian, I think it might be appropriate for us to shift into the speed round. So, Dumisani, we as you know, you've watched a few episodes, so I'm going to present you with a couple of individuals and ask you to select which you prefer and why. So we'll start with our bedrock, which is Malcolm or Martin.
Boy, I should know this by now. I always go back and forth. I'm going to say Malcolm. And the why is because though he and I fundamentally would have disagreed on certain things, I feel that the Malcolm, who especially the last year of his life, who was transitioning, he and Dr. King both killed at 39, never even saw 40 years old, was who I probably identify with the most. So yeah, I would say that part. Yeah, even though we would disagree on some things, but yes, I probably agree on more things with him than Dr. King. Some people are gonna be shocked by that. Dr. King was pro-Israel. Yeah, oh, absolutely he was. And we agreed on that. Some things we disagreed on as well.
Gandhi or Mandela?
That's a tough one too. I'll just say Mandela only because I feel like I'm more intimately aware of more of the details. I know who Gandhi was. I know what he accomplished and what he had gone through. I also know that Mandela greatly admired him as well. But again, we would have disagreed on some things as well. He had some other things. So Mandela, in the way they are similar, he was that reluctant leader. He wasn't looking to become the leader of a quote unquote movement. It just kind of happened to him. And so, yeah, I even more so I identify with him.
Golda Meir or Donald Trump?
Golda Meir, that's hard too. Boy, like, I'm going to say, this is going to shock people as well. I'll say Trump. And again, I'll give the why. Utmost respect for Golda Meir and what she accomplished, especially with her starting what was called Mashab. It's an acronym for the work that Israel did and continues to do throughout Africa. However, in terms of where I live now and understand what is so important, the first Trump administration, the lowest Black unemployment rate in the history of the recording, the largest Black vote of a Republican candidate since Nixon, and there's reasons for that. I think he, at this point in time, represents us Black folks as a community having the real debate about how we vote and why. So I think there's even more of an impact where I live, I should say that way.
Very, very thoughtful logic. And the last one is the more of a fun one. Elon Musk or Steve Jobs?
That is a fun one. You know what? I'm gonna say, boy, that shouldn't be that hard. I'm gonna say Steve Jobs, just because his body of work it has ended, and so we can like look at it from beginning to end. Elon, I might say Elon today, and a couple of years from now, I'll tell you, yeah, you know what? I want to go back and see if you guys can edit that out. I appreciate what Elon has done, his political journey in front of everybody, right? He was very left and has become more pragmatic, if I could say it that way. But Steve Jobs is an innovator. I don't know if we can. I mean, goodness gracious. The computer that I'm on right now, Steve Jobs, right? So Elon, I think Elon's will be etched in history later on, but for right now, pound for pound, I say Steve Jobs.
Dumisani, I have to tell you, if we had a betting board up for your answers, the underdog would have won, I think, every one of those. That was brilliant. Thank you.
People are gonna be shocked at the Malcolm one at the very outset, right? Yes, admire both men, yes, sir. But right now, this stage of my now, if you asked me 20 years ago, I probably would have said Dr. King.
Yes, sir.
In my 30s, 20s, but now more Malcolm X, yes, sir.
Right. Well, Dumisani, so Dumisani visited our high school, Vertex Partnership Academies, and there was a moment that we were in one of our hallways, and Dumisani is a very striking figure, tall, good-looking gentleman, just a great presence. And our students, it was a transition, and they came out and they saw this, so I'm there talking with him, and several of our students gravitated to do. It was a very beautiful moment. It was a very beautiful moment.
I love being with young people. Don't know. It was a great time for me, Ian, being there as well. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I want to talk to you about, because you grew up, I mean, all three of us grew up at a time, we were all raised by strong families. You yourself, you've been married now, what, close to 40 years? Is that right?
Yes, sir. 37 years this June.
37 years. Yes, and you have 6 children?
6 children, 3 grandchildren.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, sir. Yes,
so
sir.
Talk a little bit about I happened to present this morning at Hampton University
Mm.
on the state of the Black family because it's the 60th anniversary of the Moynihan Report.
Okay.
And we're in a very different state of family, actually, but across all races, but in particular in the Black family.
Yes, sir.
And I'm just wondering how you think about that in terms of, are you optimistic about where we are as a country, as a Black community, particularly around this issue of family
Yeah.
and the role of Black men?
Yeah.
Just to get your thoughts on that, because I have a feeling you have great perspective on this
I
issue.
and I want to be brief because again I could talk for hours on this. I I am somewhat optimistic, gentlemen. Somewhat. That's another caveat. My wife and I talk about this often, especially the last couple of years. Being a product of the '60s, right? Being born late '60s, it's not lost on us that we were born at a time in which the depletion of the Black family was happening in the most sharp way, right? From the '60s to the '70s and then beyond, right? Even then, the marriage rates were still higher than they are now, right? And of
Right.
course, the Moynihan Report, I was born in '67. The Moynihan Report came out 2 years before I was born. So the alarm bells were already being sounded. But I grew up in church, and church was very much a part of our lives. So Black men, fathers, leaders, it was not a rare thing. It was nothing to me to see Black men and women married. It wasn't a utopia, right? There's nothing perfect about it whatsoever, right? But it was a spiritual environment, religious environment, and everything. There was the wholesome enough, if you will, in terms of structure. So you knew what a family was. It wasn't strange to you. There was no such thing as baby mama. That term didn't even exist. Were there single mothers? Yes, but it's very rare. Usually, if they were of any age, they were married with children, right? Even if it was a blended family, right? So the whole thing about, the 70%, not married, that was a foreign world to us. But what struck me, however, gentlemen, and this is why that whole Dr. King, Malcolm X thing, because I'm more of a, Dr. King was loud and thing. I'm saying that is that I gravitate to that in terms of approach, the Malcolm X one, not always the ideology. Meaning, had I known then what I know now, that while we were surrounded by Black families, is at a time when I believe it was Larry Elder said a nuclear bomb was dropped on the Black family, right? That what we were living in was becoming more and more of a rarity. And that's the part for me. And I part of the thing, all due respect to all my pastors, there's nothing negative at all, because I went on to become a pastor as well. And I'm a pastor now. Not one sermon on marriage that I could tell you. Not one sermon, for example, on the Black abortion rate as opposed to the rest of the, right? Nothing. We never had those discussions, Bible studies and teachings, this, that, and the other. And that's for me, the cynic, as I got older. It's like going, okay, that's why I become more of the radical. My mind's like going, okay, that's why as a young pastor, I would teach on stuff like that I just said, marriage, family, having children, all of those things, because expressly, I was not told those things. And I was not being told those things. So when I would hear the cynical, unchurched people say negative, bad things about the church, on the one hand, I didn't like that. That was my community. But on the other hand, I understood, because part of what they were saying was, while y'all was running there getting the Holy Ghost, they were destroying our community. And you weren't talking about entrepreneurialism. You weren't talking about nuclear family. You weren't talking about the things that you should have been talking about to strengthen the community. So for me, what's interesting is that I read a couple things. I'm not sure how accurate it is. They said that marriage is back on the upswing in America. That I don't know. I've heard that kind of.
Well, we're not hemorrhaging. We're not hemorrhaging as badly as we were.
See how we're having to lower the bar to actually have the discussion right around that, right? So, and as you said, Ian, throughout American society, it's marriage isn't maybe as venerated as it was, but again, we know that in terms of the Black story, just like I told that whole spiritual Zionism, what held us together was family. For many people, was church. It was community. It was together. We grew up at a time. You wouldn't even say a swear word in front of an older person. Even if you didn't know them. Exactly. Even if you were talking like you shouldn't be talking, somebody walked up, you straighten up and yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, right? And you see the exact opposite today because of the depletion of our homes and our families. And so this was our strength. This was How did we survive, like you said, the centuries of slavery and another century of Jim Crow? Ian and I have referred often to your conversation with the other gentleman there on Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson, right? That
Yes.
100 years of prosperity. We point to that. I've shared that video over and over again and said, yes, listen, this is, that's why I told the whole superheroes thing. That's where we got it from. We were superheroes, right? And I'm trying to be whatever, but look at the people who should have never made it, but not only made it, survived and thrived. Where did Black Wall Street and the Harlem Renaissance and the Tuskegee Airmen? These are from people who are left for quote unquote dead, but not only did they not die, look at what they built. So when we look at that and we know that the family was the core of that, well, of course, if I was a nefarious person and I wanted to undo that, I'd go after their family. It's okay. You know what? You hit that family, it's going to have a ripple effect on everything else. And my God, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dumisani, well then maybe it's appropriate to end on this last question for you to give some advice as we think about the rising generation. And as you may know, when Nique and I started this Invisible Men 30 plus years ago, it was because we felt the narrative, everything you're talking about, the narrative of this idea of strong Black families, strong faith, it became invisible, and it suffered against this more dominant narrative of, Black oppression, suppression, lack of agency.
Yes.
And we created this 16-year-old Black kid, Daryl, who's trying to figure out his way in the world, and curious what your advice would be to Daryl, given everything that you have developed, your own family, what you're seeing. What would you say to Daryl to give him advice for how he should shape his future?
I would say to Daryl, other than his spiritual journey, his spiritual identity, without becoming sectarian, and that what would be the thing that would define him the most is family. I would say to Daryl that him building a strong family, as they say, the old folks used to say, find yourself a good woman, right? Get a wife, raise children, right? Build businesses, knowing that that will be the core of not just his identity, but of his children. And then I would also tell Daryl, especially if he's a Black American, I would point to our history. And I would say, to your point, where people unfortunately have pointed out victimization, I always tell young people, always learn the whole story. Right? Don't be victimized by part of the story. Don't let them tell you that they burned down Black Wall Street in Tulsa without them telling you that they actually rebuilt it less than 2 years later, and it was bigger and better and more thriving than ever before. Right? Know that yes, these are all the difficulties and the pitfalls that we went through as a people, but let that give you even more of a sense of pride and self-worth with how we built what we built. That's what I would say to Daryl. Let no one victimize you. I don't know, but as soon as you feel somebody pulling out the violin and patting you on the head and they're a little bit, understand that person is not your friend. He's not. Can I say this last thing? There was it was a small thing in Remember the Titans. It was based on a real thing, but of course Denzel Washington, that movie back in the 90s, I think it was. And there's that one scene, gentlemen, in which Denzel argues with the white coach who is pampering the other player. Denzel, of course, is this firebrand, and he was always yelling in people's face and very, very militant, if you will, the way he did it. And he saw the white coach, he would pamper this other young Black player who had some potential, was really struggling. And Denzel laid into him. He says, I'm paraphrasing, how is he ever going to get better if you keep babying him that way? He said, he said, I may be a mean cuss, but I'm a mean cuss to everybody. He said, you pick out the Black one. He said, I yell at the white the players and the Black players, but you pick out this one who pat him on the head. And I'll never forget that when it came out, I said, that's what I was saying, that for us, struggle, if you will, made us strong. We actually were able to define who we were, especially in the spiritual sense. We're called on God. Well, for us, God showed up because look at what he did. Look at where we were. Look where we actually wound up being. I would tell Daryl, embrace, but learn the whole story. Don't be manipulated by half of the story. You go and learn the whole story and let that inform who you are and your pride and self-worth in who you are.
I love it. I love it. We actually worked on a curriculum, worked with Bob Woodson, on Tulsa. Yes. And the whole point is that first you teach about what happened before the Tulsa Massacre,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
How is it that all these Black entrepreneurs during Jim Crow segregation
Yes, sir.
were able to raise capital, build businesses, create Black Wall Street
Yes, sir.
during that period of time?
Yes, sir.
And if we could be that successful then,
Right.
when discrimination and racism was enshrined into law,
Yes, sir.
what's holding us back now?
Yes,
But
sir.
then also teach about the massacre
Yes, sir.
and teach about the rebuild,
Yes, sir.
right?
Absolutely.
I love that advice. Don't get hoodwinked by only half of the story.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Bamboozled.
Bamboozled.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Love it.
100%.
I love it. Wow. Well, Dumisani, there's lots of wisdom that you shared with us and our listeners. Thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for your continued work in creating this, cross alliance too with the Jewish community. I think it's very, very powerful. Very powerful.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'll certainly be buying the book, my brother. And I'll tell you, if someone asks me about you, the first word that comes out of my mouth is independent. And you have clearly articulated a worldview that is free of those blinders. A lot of what you said reminded me of Ian's book. And the fact that agency was taken from us in so many instances. But that's certainly not the case with your life. Very proud of you, brother.
Thank you, gentlemen. Again, I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity, and we'll continue to follow the work that you all are doing.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So that wraps up this episode of The Invisible Men. If you'd like to see other episodes, you can go to www.invisible.men, or you can go to wherever podcasts, where you listen to Apple, Spotify. We're all over the place. But Dumisani, Nique, great to see you. And thank you to our listeners.